Hey guys, Andrew Shrout here in the sideboard. I'm here with Kent Ketter, one of the at-large participants here in the Players' Championship.
That is correct.
And we're here to talk about your standard deck.
Absolutely.
So to the surprise of probably no one, you're playing Mardu.
Yes.
This is a deck that you've been playing all season long.
Correct.
So let's start from the top. Kind of walk us through the card choices here.
Sure. So one of the big things like with Mardu, and I think a lot of people fail to recognize, is that it's about the early game. Yes, you're a mid-range deck technically on paper, but you have, I feel, one of the strongest turns, 1 through 4 in the format. Okay. You have the ability with cards like Seeker of the Way and Goblin Rabblemaster to set yourself up in those first few turns that by the time you transition to the mid-game, all of your highly efficient removal is going to help those two cards specifically close out the game in quick fashion. Okay. At the Invitational last week, I was winning. Majority of my matches or games that I was winning was off of being so far ahead by turn 4 or 5 that very few decks in the format can catch up from if you're dropping Seekers and Rabble-Masters, that sort of thing.
All right. So you've got Seeker of the Way and Goblin Rabble-Master to kind of establish the initiative.
Yeah, you got to get it early. Seeker's also really important because you are against some of the aggressive decks. You do need to trade combat steps. Let them hit you for some, and then you can cast a removal spell, hit them back.
Right.
And the whole thing is, they lose the initiative, in the combat step, which is nice to have against aggro.
Yeah, the lifelink is huge there. So take the initiative with the 2 and 3 drops, and then your old friend Stormbreath Dragon.
Absolutely.
To keep that initiative.
So the way that Mardu, if it can establish that early game and just power through and close out the game quickly, it seamlessly transitions into a true mid-range deck. And throughout the season, I had toyed with different 5 drops. I mean, we had to play Butcher of the Horde, that sort of thing. And now that we've gotten to where we're at now with the format, I felt like being as aggressive as possible within reason. Okay. Stormbreath Dragon fits the bill. He's a very good defensive creature. There are a lot of decks in the format that they don't know what to do against him. And as far as stats for cost go, he fits perfectly in both your aggro and mid-range, concepts.
Okay. Let's talk a little about some of the less marquee but still sweet threats here.
So Brimaz, in my eyes, in this deck is really just filling Rabblemaster 5 and 6 slots.
Okay.
He does have the ability to take over the game on his own much more decisively than Rabblemaster does. So that's something to keep in mind. But when I view him in my hands, most of the time I'm just picturing him as a Nether Rabblemaster.
Okay.
With a little bit more control. You're not as aggressive. It doesn't impact the board immediately. But the longer he lives, the stronger your board control comes.
Okay.
Ashcloud Phoenix, I was having issues with Mardu being able to close out some games in the mid-range matchups. Okay. If they're able to trade a downfall for your dragon and that sort of thing, you sometimes just lose that ability to deal the last couple points of damage. And playing against Ashcloud Phoenix and playing with it, I've realized that your late game concept with this card simply becomes attack, it dies, flip it, take 2, rinse, repeat over and over. And it was really nice to have a single card that ties into the aggressive concept that lets you grind through the mid-range game.
Sure. And then Chandra, of course, also very good at grinding through the mid-range game.
Yes. So normally your Mardu decks, they're playing, your Sorins, your Sarkins, your Elspeths. You're trying to go bigger and better and badder than everyone else. Chandra, on the other hand, is doing one thing or 2 things. Its abilities are very pointed. Sure. The +1 is one of the best cards for your aggressive decks. You see your green-red monster decks, you see your your tokens decks play it to just blank that one blocker to get that combat step in. And then obviously the 0 ability is just super important to be able to transition if you have to become that mid-range deck because that sometimes is required.
Sure.
If you can protect the Chandra with your selection of tokens, she'll just take over the game on her own. So.
Just drawing more cards than the opponent.
Yep.
So
and then
age-old
always threatening to just blank their combat step if they attack inappropriately. Sure. Or, you draw that extra haster off the top, they're down 1 blocker, you're +1 attacker, and suddenly their life total's looking real slim.
Yeah. And then Whirling Outburst, kind of the yin to Goblin Rabblemaster's yang.
Yeah, so Outburst was something that without me playing Butcher of the Horde in this version, I was a little hesitant as far as the role Outburst was going to play. But then one of the later cards, Stoke the Flames, brought that back around. It's just super important in your aggro matchups. It's a handful of blockers. In your control matchup, I mean, it's 3 separate attackers off the top. They're not necessarily going to deal a ton of damage on their own, but when you factor in that its ability to make a Rabblemaster go from 1 damage to attacking for 6 or 7.
Right.
That's basically exactly what you want. So it's another flexible card that can be aggressive, but its ability to put a bunch of blockers in play means you can grind through to that mid-range game a little bit better. Gives time for your Stormbreath Dragons and your Ash Cloud Phoenixes to just take it over.
All right. And then onto the removal spells.
Oh, yeah.
Chain to the Rocks, one of the marquee removal spells, probably the reason to be in the white-red color combination.
100%. If for a while I played the red-black versions and we looked at cards like Murderous Cut, but this is the best 1-mana removal spell available to red-white. So the more I had played with it, and originally, Brad's version from way back, right after the Pro Tour, I'd played 3. But with me being more aggressive, I need my removal to be more consistent, and Chain to the Rocks just does everything you need it to do. Not a lot of people are playing Stormbreath Dragon. I'm kind of in a minority there, so I'm pretty safe chaining up all the other creatures. And some people are worried about the downside of, if I chain a Rhino, it comes back. Things happen.
Sure.
It's usually quite all right because if you chain their utility creature, they're in this concept of they're in this struggle of, do I glare the chain to get back my 2/4, or do I glare your threat?
Right.
And that's exactly where you want them to be. You want them to be, chained is something that it can put them in positions where they think they can get value back by dealing with it. But a lot of times you're happy with them. All right, that's fine. You get it back. Neat.
Sure. Then Lightning Strike. Sometimes you got to throw some fire.
Yeah, Lightning Strike's super important in the Rabble Master matchups where you need to basically, it's all about, breaking that serve. Like if you're on the draw and on their turn 3 they go Rabble Master and you just strike it immediately and then you untap into Rabble Master, the game is nearly over at that point. Also the damage is pretty important when you transition into this next set of removal.
Yeah.
If you'll notice, the Chain of the Rocks is the only removal spell that doesn't deal damage.
Sure.
All my other removal spells are dealing you damage if we get to that stage in the game, and that's a concession to the difficulty you have with some of the more controlling mid-range decks or the control decks. It's nice making all of your removal spells that in a control matchup would normally be dead. Against the control decks, I now have a very good plan B. Also, a lot of control decks in this format, once they're at a life total, they're not going to just jump back up Sphinx's Revelation style. They've got to, maybe incrementally get themselves back up, which makes all of these cards live.
And then the last spell in the deck. Now, we've been calling this Mardu this whole time. We haven't actually seen a black card yet. Until along comes Crackling Doom.
Absolutely.
So this is basically just red-white, but you had to have Crackling Doom.
Right. So it was the thought that Mardu, with its ability to play Butcher of the Horde and that sort of thing, it's nice and everything, but I felt like the red-white shell of aggression was just better, for this given tournament. But Crackling Doom is the glue that holds it all together. It's really important to make sure that your removal is able to hit, a wide array of things. And Crackling Doom is dealing damage. It's your catch-all against the blue-white heroic deck, and that's one of your better matchups. So you really want to just keep a card like Crackling Doom just in case. Who knows what's going to happen? Who's going to throw things down on the other side of the table? Sack a creature. Let's go to our combat steps.
Sure. Crackling Doom does not discriminate. It will always solve the biggest problem.
Anyone and everyone. Just if you're on the board and I don't want you there, we'll try to Crackling Doom it. So.
All right. We'll talk a little bit about the mana base because this is a little different than normal. I know you've tried variants of Mardu, so all different, like red, black, splash, white. And more balanced 3-color builds. So how do you come up with the mana base for this particular version that is just barely touching black?
Right. So this particular version, I feel like this is probably the best mana I've had in a Mardu deck. So the struggle you run into with your Chain to the Rock decks is you have to keep your mountain count high. And that was kind of a struggle when you were trying to play more black spells. By me trimming the black spells down to specific instances, I'm able to run, instead of plains, I can run 4 caves, which is a plains plus a swamp. Nomad Outpost kind of takes the spot of some of your Scrylands, that sort of thing. It fixes all your colors. It's typically the best turn 1 play. But what I really did with the mana base was just I took a red-white aggressive mana base and figured out what is the way I can get my black sources in here without affecting the overall red versus white count. There's only on the next slide, there's only 1 swamp in the entire deck. So there's 1 source in the deck that doesn't cast everything else. And I'm pretty happy with those numbers.
So of course, you have 4 Bloodstained Mire to get the 1 swamp. And so you started with what, like an 11 mountains, 6 plains mana base, and just converted it to.
And just made the minor concessions I needed to play Crackling Doom. I feel like the mana is very good. The ability for me to play, I have 8 red-white dual lands in the deck between Outposts and the Scry lands.
Okay.
It makes it where I get to cast the spells I want on curve, and since I'm a more aggressive slanted Mardu deck, that's very, very important.
Sure. All right. Let's talk a little bit about your preparation for this particular event.
Absolutely.
Because it's a small tournament. We know a lot of the players, and a lot of you guys are friends. It's pretty easy to put several of the players on a pretty narrow range.
Absolutely.
So how much did that affect your deck selection, your card selection?
So in the initial kind of, we'll say, metagaming for the tournament, in Standard specifically, myself and Joe Lissette, we worked together, and we kind of broke it down by who had played what over the past few months. And then we realized more and more with Standard, as much as comfort is important for the Standard format, it's really starting to get that weird slant where you just play whatever you're best with, whatever you're most comfortable with, because there's so many viable strategies. So we initially had tried to metagame specifically to figure out what people would play, and then we realized we were better off just deciding which decks were going to be considered powerful enough for people to pilot.
Okay.
And that's really what kind of led me to the decision to play Mardu again, is I felt like Blue-White Heroic it's going to be here.
Sure.
I would say 2 to 4 copies I'd be pretty comfortable with. 4's on the high side, but with that being a popular deck, and with the ability for Mardu to just be that aggressive-oriented mid-range deck, it felt like kind of like a no-brainer that I can match up with the other mid-range decks, but I have a primary plan that lets me hopefully kill them before we even set up.
All right. Let's talk a little about your sideboard. We'll kind of just go card by card. See what's going on with these things. Let's start with Hushwing Gryff.
Sure, Hushwing Gryff. So in previous versions of Mardu, my answer to the whip decks was to look at cards like Burn Away or some of your more controlling elements in hostilities. Well, with being more of a red-white aggro deck, I had to start looking for other ways to deal with Hornet Queen and Siege Rhino.
Sure.
Hushwing Gryff fits the bill perfectly. It lets me trim. If I want to cut out a couple Rabble Masters based on the matchup, it fits perfectly into that slot. He's aggressive, and the ability to, against the Abzan deck or against the Whip deck, if they immediately tap out and try to slam their guy, and you flash in Hushwing Gryff, that card just became one of the least efficient spells in their deck. Hornet Queen specifically, but even Siege Rhino, 4/5 for 4, against the removal heavy deck. Not really that big of a deal. I just cut off your ability to race my clock. I'm happy as could be with that.
Sure. Glare of Heresy.
Glare of Heresy
for white cards.
Yeah, it just there's gonna be a lot of white cards. It's good against Heroic. It's good against the Mirror. It's good against Abzan. It's good against Elspeth. It's good against everything. It just felt like one of those cards that I needed to have the most efficient removal upgrades available in my sideboard. Glare of Heresy fits that bill. It's also, very good against the Jeskai variations, hitting both Mantis Rider, which is a card that I'm personally afraid of with my strategy, and the Ascendancy itself.
Okay. Scouring Sands.
Just a concession to the token matchup. I really had wanted to play Doomwake Giants, but I realized more and more that I needed to I was better off trading as efficiently as possible with their with their token producers, and the ability to play Scouring Sands into a threat in a given turn. It's much more important than being able to cast a Doomwake Giant that might trigger once or twice, in a given match.
All right. Moving on, we have 2 Erase.
Yep. It's one of those cards. It deals with whips. It deals with Blue-White Heroic. It picks off a chain if you needed to.
Yep.
Just a flexible card that ensures we're not going to lose to the wide assortment of enchantments available. Corsair Crewfix is another one that I'm pretty happy if I get to erase a Corsair.
All right. And then rounding out this slide, cards you've already seen.
Absolutely. Yeah, Crackling Doom. Having the 4th for, as I've said before, Blue-White Heroic. It sounds like I'm harping on it, but I feel like that deck is something that if you just devote some sideboard slots to, or you devote your 75 to beating it, it's very beatable, and I enjoy being able to pick up a free win or two off of proper deck construction.
Okay.
And then the Dragon, I'd feel bad if I left one at home. They kind of travel in a pack.
Fair.
But in truthfulness, Abzan, it's a card that really pressures them really well, and the control strategies, if they tap out for Wrath, I love going, all right, you Wrath, I'm for you. That's great, back and forth. So, yeah, it's too important to leave a copy like that home. I even was so important
got a 5th one,
that I brought a 5th one. And Sarkhan gives you a little bit more flexibility in your Abzan matchups. It has the ability to pick off a Corsair. but it's a 5th dragon. It happens to have some other text, but it's just a 5th dragon.
All right.
And then Banishing Light, that was kind of just one of the catch-alls that just rounded out, what I was presenting.
Okay.
It lets me, basically it lets me hit the planeswalkers that I'd be, concerned about, like Elspeth, that sort of thing. It's definitely not as good as some of the black options that I could have available in Downfall or Utterend, but I was comfortable with playing 1 to ensure that I wasn't stretching the mana too far.
Sure. And then rounding out the sideboard, we have 1 Utterend, the 5th black card.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's 5 in the deck. And that was kind of one of those where I had been looking at more Banishing Lights or another Glare, and I was just like, let's get a catch-all that gives me, a little bit of creature removal. I like being able to board up to 1 more removal spell against the monster-style decks, Timur and that sort of thing.
All right.
And then the Battlefield Forge, I got to cast dragons. 5th land, 25th land. It's just having the ability to board into a true mid-range deck is very, very important. Very typically, I'm like cutting a Seeker in the control matchups to bring in the 25th land. And it's a Battlefield Forge, so being an untapped land I thought was pretty important.
I love that one of our game plans post-board is bring more dragons and more ways to cast our dragons.
That's all it is. I mean, I have faith in Stormbreath Dragon in the given format. I've had faith in it all year, but I'm pretty confident in it at this exact instance that it's a card that I want 5 or 6 copies of.
Right, fair enough. Thanks for coming in and walking through it with us.
Absolutely, no problem.
Stick around. We've got plenty more coverage coming of the Players' Championship here in Roanoke.